is a management book published in 1982, more than 40 years ago. Even relevant today? So much has changed. We have the internet, which wasn't around, we have the mobile phone, which wasn't around then. We have so much different now. 40 years is a long, long time in any era. But there is one such book which I include in my top 5 management books of all time, In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and Robert Waterman. Tom Peters became one of the world's leading consultants post writing this book. Why is this book so relevant? 40 years since it was first published. The principles and insights in this book are still relevant and valuable today. This was perhaps the first book which talked about people, customer, and innovation. Innovation was a very new word at that time, but Tom Peters brought it to life. He shared stories of leading companies around the world which had adopted innovation in the 1970s when this book was written and convinced the world that innovation will be the future. And we have already seen in the last 25, 40 years that innovation indeed was the future. So Tom Peters was right in that sense. We also know that customer focus has been the cornerstone of most companies in the last 40 years or so, at least the most successful ones. So Tom Peters was right there as well. We also know that people focused companies have done really well in the last 25 to 40 years. So Tom Peters was right on all three counts that he predicted in this book in 1982. Why should we read this book 40 years after it was published? One, of course, it has influenced a generation of thinkers and management professionals, including myself and many others. So that is reason enough. Second, it talks of innovation as a core pillar. So you will actually go to the roots of where this innovation concept actually started. Thirdly, it provides a historical context to many of the management practices that are discussed today. But what is this book about? I already told you this book is about a lot of stories and concepts from the 1970s. The stories may not be so relevant today because many of these stories you might already know, but the lessons certainly are relevant. So let me bring to you the 8 key lessons from this book. Firstly, people matter. So this book was one of the first few books to describe that in the future, and this was 1980s, in the future, people will matter more than anything else. Right? So companies which are people centric, people focused will do well. Two, bias for action. Again, this was one of the first few books to talk about more of action and less of strategy and planning. Not to say that strategy and planning is not important, but Tom Peters and Robert Waterman were able to show execution or acting on the plan was perhaps more important than the plan itself. Third, autonomy and entrepreneurship. Yes, entrepreneurship was a word that Tom Peters used in this book in 1982. It was probably written in the last few years of 1970s, published in 1982. So you can imagine how far ahead this man was for his generation. Fourth, productivity and efficiency. Again, this was the precursor to the Toyota production system. This was the precursor to lean thinking. This was precursor to any other book on the subject. And yet it talked about productivity and efficiency as a key pillar of any organizational. Amazing, isn't it? 1982 stories from 1970s, and yet he saw this far. Stick to the knitting. Stick to the knitting is another word for core competence, which later on C.K. Prahlad popularized. So again, Tom Peters was far ahead of his time. He had already, in a way, theorized that sticking to the knitting or core competence or focusing on what you do well will be the future. 7. Simplicity and minimalism. Tom Peters was able to see that companies in the 1970s, which focused on minimalism, which means simplified processes, simple processes, minimal action, minimal delay, and were able to add value, did well. So his theory was that this will grow in the future. And how right was he? Since this book came out, things like Six Sigma, Lean, automation, all these things only try to make all processes simple. So again, Tom Peters and Robert Waterman were ahead of their time. The last one, eighth one, hands-on and value-driven. Leaders who are actively involved in the day-to-day operations of their companies will tend to be successful. And if you see the trend later on, most leaders who have done well or taken their companies to new heights were actually very involved in the operations. They knew the company inside out. Amazing, isn't it? This was 1982. Book was possibly written in the last few years of 1970s, and yet the 8 principles that it shared have defined the next 40 years and probably led to many more books, concepts, and ideas management has seen since then. So just in case you don't know Tom Peters is one of world's foremost leadership and management gurus. A little, I would say, unconventional and challenges the paradigm quite a bit. And he's built his name around that. Starting from this book, later on he has written many other books, but this book defined him and his career. He was among the first to emphasize the importance of people, innovation, and empowerment. Now, I mostly talk about mid-career blues and how people can upskill and upgrade themselves during mid-career. And this is one of the books I or recommend. Why should you read this book in your mid-career? Firstly, career advancement. If you understand how a company operates, if you understand what makes a company work, you are likely to grow and do better in that company. Second, leadership development. Again, understanding how companies operate helps you to develop your own leadership skill set. For example, if you know that outcomes matter, then you will probably be a little bit more result oriented. If you know that people matter, you will probably be a little bit more people focused. And third and most important, innovation and adaptability. Everything that we do today is about being adaptable and flexible while staying focused on certain key principles. Do that. This is a classic, once again, In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and Robert Waterman, one of my top 5 books of all time in the management space. Have you read this classic? And if you have, let me know in comments what are your memories of this book. If you don't know me, my name is Anshuman Tiwari. I'm a top voice on LinkedIn, and every Monday for the last 1.5 years approximately, I share a book review. So if you do want to read more of my summaries, please follow me on LinkedIn and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Till the next book, manage better.